remember the sound of the clock that night, each tick so loud it almost spoke for me. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, the same as every Christmas before, yet I could already tell something had changed. My mother's voice filled the dining room, polished and firm, guiding conversation as if she were conducting a choir. My brother and his wife sat beside her, their children giggling over toy reindeer. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. I hadn't been back in 3 years, not since Father's funeral. I'd stayed away because peace was easier to build elsewhere, far from the polite cruelty that had always lingered here. But when the invitation came, written in her neat, slanted handwriting, "Come home for Christmas. It's time." I thought maybe time had softened her. I was wrong. Dinner began with laughter, the kind that feels like a performance. My mother complimented my brother's promotion, my sister-in-law's baking, even the children's posture. When it came to me, she smiled too long, her wine glass glinting under the chandelier. "And then there's Emily," she said, her voice warm but sharp underneath. Still, finding herself, I suppose. The room chuckled softly, unsure whether it was meant as humor. I smiled, because that's what I'd been trained to do since childhood, to stay gentle even while bleeding. I lifted my glass, pretending the comment hadn't pierced anything vital. But the moment came later, after the second course, when silence draped over the table like frost. My mother sighed, as if weighed down by some moral duty. "I think it's time to be honest," she said. "Emily, you don't belong here anymore." No one spoke. Even the children stopped fidgeting. The ticking clock grew louder, the kind of sound you feel in your bones. She continued, steady and deliberate. "You've made your choices. You left this family when we needed you most. It's not right to come back pretending everything's fine." For a heartbeat, the air vanished. I looked at her, the woman who'd taught me manners before mercy, silence before truth. She was calm, confident, certain she was justified. The others looked away, pretending their cutlery needed rearranging. And then I laughed. Quietly, but it was enough to fracture the tension. Her eyes flickered with confusion, then fear, the kind that only appears when control begins to slip. I lifted my glass, the same way she always did before one of her speeches. If you've ever felt unwelcome in your own home, I'd tell anyone listening now, you know that laughter is the only way to keep from breaking. I stood slowly, the stem of the glass catching the golden light. "You're right, Mother," I said softly. "I don't belong here, not the way you want me to, but I came back for a reason." Her expression faltered, though her voice stayed smooth. "And what reason is that?" "To remind you," I said, raising the glass just enough to reflect her face in the wine, "that you don't get to rewrite the truth just because it's Christmas." I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just drank. The room stayed still. The only sound the faint clinking of silverware as my brother shifted uncomfortably. When I set the glass down, it left a ring on the white tablecloth, a perfect, quiet mark that would never wash out. That was the moment everything began to change. After that night, silence became the language of the house. It stretched between the walls, heavy and deliberate, the kind that made every breath feel like an intrusion. My mother didn't speak to me the next morning. She moved around the kitchen like a shadow, pouring coffee and slicing fruit, as though the conversation from the night before had been a dream no one wanted to admit having. My brother kept his eyes on his phone. My sister-in-law hummed softly to fill the space. Even the children had learned, too young, when not to speak. I sat at the table, my fingers tracing the faint ring left by my glass, still visible beneath the light, a perfect circle of defiance. My mother's voice broke the quiet eventually. "You embarrassed me," she said, not looking up. "In front of my family." "I am your family," I replied, my tone measured even. "That's what makes it embarrassing, isn't it?" She turned then, eyes cold but steady. "You always twist things to make yourself the victim." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from years of being misunderstood. It teaches you that silence can be louder than anger. After breakfast, I walked outside. The snow from the night before had hardened into a fragile crust that cracked softly underfoot. The air was sharp, bright, and cruelly honest. I remembered winters here when I was a child, the sound of Father's laughter, the smell of pine needles, the way he used to pull me on the old wooden sled until I couldn't breathe from joy. He had been the balance to her control, the softness that made her sharp edges seem manageable. And when he died, something in her hardened completely, as if she'd decided that love was an indulgence she couldn't afford anymore. Inside, I could hear faint music playing from the living room. Her favorite carols, the ones she'd play on repeat each year, as though nostalgia could erase what she refused to confront. I lingered by the window, watching her reflection in the glass. She was sitting perfectly straight, flipping through old photo albums. My brother joined her, and they laughed at something I couldn't hear. From where I stood, I looked like an outsider peering into someone else's life. That night, I found myself drawn to the attic. It hadn't changed in years. The same dust, the same smell of cedar and forgotten things. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, each labeled in my mother's tidy handwriting. Christmas decor 1994, old letters, family photos. I opened the last one. Inside, beneath yellowed envelopes and curled photographs, I found a small wooden box tied with a faded green ribbon. My name was written on it, not hers. The handwriting wasn't her neat cursive. It was my father's. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the ribbon. Inside lay an envelope and a folded note. The envelope was addressed to my mother. The letter inside was addressed to me. The first line was his voice, clear as memory. If you're reading this, it means the house has forgotten what kindness feels like. I sat down on the floor, the words blurring slightly as I read. He wrote about her resentment, how it had grown from envy into quiet cruelty, how she'd turned her disappointment into punishment. He wrote that he'd left something else for me, something hidden beneath the truth she'd tried to bury. At the bottom, a final line. Love doesn't belong to those who hoard it. It belongs to those who forgive. I folded the letter carefully, pressing my palm against the ink as though it could still carry warmth. The snow outside had begun again, soft flakes drifting through the attic window. I stayed there for a long time, surrounded by memories too heavy to move. When I finally came downstairs, my mother was sitting alone in the living room, the firelight painting her face in uneven gold and shadow. She looked up, startled, as if she'd seen a ghost. Maybe she had. "Where have you been?" she asked quietly. "In the attic," I said. "With him." Her eyes widened, fear flashing across them for the briefest second before she caught herself. "You shouldn't dig through old things," she whispered. I stepped closer, calm, deliberate. "Some things are buried because they're forgotten," I said. "Others are buried because someone doesn't want them found." She didn't reply. The fire crackled softly between us, each spark a memory refusing to die, and in that silence I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the unearthing. That night, sleep felt like something I didn't deserve. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the old house creaking as if it were restless too. My father's letter replayed in my mind, every word threading itself through the silence. Love doesn't belong to those who hoard it. I wondered if he had known how far her bitterness would spread, how precisely it would shape the years that followed. Maybe he had, and maybe that was why he'd hidden his truth in the attic, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to bring it back to light. By morning, the snow had stopped. The air felt colder than before, brittle, almost breakable. My mother avoided me entirely. She stayed busy polishing silverware that didn't need polishing, wiping counters already spotless, moving from one meaningless task to the next like a soldier marching without orders. My brother was gone for errands, or maybe escape. It didn't matter. The house felt smaller with just us in it. I sat by the window, holding the folded letter in my hands, the paper soft from age but still carrying his scent faintly, something between pine and tobacco. My mother walked past me once, glanced at it, then quickly looked away. Her reaction told me everything. She already knew what it contained. Or worse, she feared what it might reveal. After lunch, I went back to the attic. Not to search, but to think. I noticed something I hadn't before. A small chest pushed against the far wall, its hinges rusted and its wood faded by years of winter air. The latch opened easily. Inside were old photo albums, newspaper clippings, and a single small velvet pouch. When I emptied it, a gold locket fell into my palm. It opened with a soft click. Inside was a photograph of my parents, younger, smiling in a way I'd never seen. Behind it, folded tightly, was another note, this one written in her hand. The ink was faint but clear. You promised me I'd never lose to her. My breath caught. It wasn't addressed to him, not directly. It felt like a fragment of something larger. A confession that didn't belong to me, but somehow explained everything. I sat there for a long time, the house quiet below me, until I finally understood what he had meant in his letter. Her love hadn't withered by accident. It had been built around competition, jealousy, the constant fear of being replaced by what she could never control. Affection freely given. When I came downstairs, she was waiting at the bottom of the staircase. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. "You've been in the attic again," she said softly. "Yes," I answered, "and I think I understand now." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Understand what?" "That you hated him for loving me the way he did." For a moment her composure broke. Just a flicker, a tremor in her jaw, a hesitation in her breath, but I saw it. She turned away, walking toward the fireplace where the flames had nearly died. "He gave you everything," she said quietly. "Every glance, every kindness. I was the one who stayed, who kept things together. And yet it was always you he looked at first." There it was. The truth, bare and unguarded. The sound of it hung between us, fragile and raw. I didn't feel anger anymore, only something like sorrow. For her, for him, for all the years lost to envy disguised as control. I took a step closer. "He left you love," I said, "and you turned it into punishment." She laughed once, but it wasn't laughter. It was defense. "And you turned it into pity." Her words struck harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. In that moment, I realized we were mirrors of each other, different reflections of the same wound. She needed to be needed, and I needed to be free. Both of us were chasing love we no longer knew how to give. The room felt too small for both our truths. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the locket, and placed it on the mantel. "This belongs to both of you," I said softly. "Maybe it's time it stopped belonging to me." Her gaze followed the gold as it caught the light. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but her hands trembled slightly. The fire cracked once, scattering sparks across the hearth. Without another word, I walked away, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The truth had already begun its quiet work, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, only felt. As I reached the hallway, I heard her whisper faintly, almost to herself, "He always said you'd come back for the right reason." I stopped, my hand resting on the banister. "Maybe I did," I said, though I wasn't sure she heard me. Upstairs, I placed my father's letter back in the box, alongside the locket's empty pouch. Some gifts were never meant to be opened at once. They had to unfold slowly, like forgiveness. And though the house remained cold, I knew something had shifted. Not warmth yet, but something close. The kind of silence that waits for light. The next morning felt different. The air inside the house had changed, lighter, though no one spoke about why. My mother didn't mention the attic, the locket, or the words that had passed between us. Yet beneath her silence, I sensed something shifting, a quiet tremor in the foundation of her certainty. The breakfast table was meticulously set, as always, but the way she poured my coffee, carefully without spilling a drop, felt almost like apology disguised as habit. By afternoon, the house filled again with voices. My brother returned, his wife and children trailing behind, laughter echoing down the hallway like nothing had ever fractured. It was the second dinner of the season, a tradition born from her insistence on perfection. "We'll do it right this time," she said under her breath as she adjusted the silverware, her words aimed at herself as much as me. I watched her from the doorway, her movements rehearsed yet slightly slower, as if each gesture carried new weight. For years, she'd used control as armor. Now it looked more like exhaustion. When evening came, the house glowed in soft gold light. The table was immaculate again, crystal glasses aligned, candles flickering like small obedient stars. I took my seat across from her, and for a moment our eyes met. There was no challenge there, only recognition. My brother began talking about business, his voice filling the silence. But my mind was elsewhere. On the letter, the locket, and the words she hadn't said. The meal moved forward like a ritual everyone had memorized. Laughter rose at polite intervals. Wine was poured, and for a while even I began to believe in the illusion of peace. But illusions have fragile edges, and truth, once spoken, has a way of finding its way back into the room. Halfway through dinner, she lifted her glass. The gesture was familiar, graceful, commanding, a signal for attention. "I'd like to say something," she began, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "This family means everything to me, even when it doesn't look that way." She hesitated then, eyes flickering toward me. "I've made mistakes in trying to protect what I thought needed protecting." The room fell still. My brother shifted uneasily. My sister-in-law reached for his hand. My mother drew in a slow breath. "We've all said things we regret," she continued, "and some things can't be undone. But I want tonight to be different." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. It was the smallest crack, but it was real. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I lifted my glass slowly, not to interrupt, but to meet her halfway. "To truth," I said softly, "even when it comes late." Her eyes glistened just for a second. "To truth," she echoed. The glasses clinked. A sound so small, yet it seemed to echo through the years we'd both lost. My brother smiled uncertainly, sensing something had passed between us but not daring to name it. After dinner, the guests drifted into the living room. The fire burned low, the light flickering over old photographs hanging on the wall, our childhoods frozen in frames. My mother lingered behind, collecting plates with slow precision. I offered to help. She didn't answer at first, then nodded once, wordlessly handing me the serving tray. As we moved around the table, she said quietly, "He wanted you to have the house one day." I stopped mid-step. "What?" Her eyes stayed on the tablecloth. "Your father. He changed the deed before he died. I found out after, but I never told you." "Why?" I asked. She looked up at me, her expression bare, vulnerable. "Because it felt like losing him twice." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. All the years of distance, the cruelty, the silences, they weren't born only of malice, but of grief she didn't know how to carry. I set the tray down carefully. "It's not about the house," I said. "It never was." She nodded, tears finally spilling, not dramatically but quietly, as if they had been waiting their whole life to be allowed. "I know," she whispered, "but I needed you to stay angry. It was easier than losing you completely." The firelight flickered across her face, softening her features into something almost tender. For the first time in years, I saw her not as the woman who'd shut me out, but as the woman who'd once tried to love me the only way she knew. By control, by fear, by the boundaries she mistook for strength. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. The warmth of her skin felt fragile but real, like something that had survived a long winter. "Maybe," I said quietly, "we can start again." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Maybe," she replied, "but you'll have to teach me how." I squeezed her hand once, then let go. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, each flake melting as it touched the glass. As I raised my glass one final time, the reflection of the fire shimmered within it. Light after darkness, warmth after years of cold. And this time, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like peace finally learning how to stay. The next morning, the house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence that used to choke me. It was softer, almost restful, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after years of holding their breath. I woke to the faint sound of the wind brushing against the window and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, I lay still listening. No tension, no unspoken threat, just the sound of morning. When I walked downstairs, my mother was sitting by the window in her robe, a cup in her hands. The light caught her face, softer than I remembered, framed by the pale glow of falling snow. She looked up when I entered, her expression hesitant but open. "I made enough for two," she said. I nodded, pouring myself a cup. The steam rose between us, curling gently in the air like a truce taking form. We didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary. Sometimes peace doesn't begin with conversation. It begins with stillness shared between two people who finally understand the weight of what they've carried. After a while, she reached into the pocket of her robe and placed something on the table, a small folded piece of paper. It was old, the edges frayed, the ink faded. "He wrote this the night before he went into the hospital," she said quietly. "I couldn't bring myself to read it until last night." I looked down at it, unsure whether she meant for me to open it. But she nodded, so I did. The handwriting was his, steady but weaker than in the letter I'd found in the attic. "If love ever turns to pride, remember that forgiveness is what makes family real. One day when the snow falls again, I hope you'll both find your way home." The words were simple, but they filled the room like music. My throat tightened. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mother's eyes glistened as she looked out at the snow. "He always said winter was his favorite season," she murmured. "Said it made everything honest again." We sat there, two versions of the same story, finally reading from the same page. Later, I helped her prepare breakfast. The simple motions, slicing fruit, toasting bread, feeling almost ceremonial. Every small act felt like a quiet apology, a way of rebuilding trust without needing to name it. My brother joined us eventually, confused by the calm. He watched us laugh softly over burnt toast and seemed uncertain whether to smile. But then he did. And just like that, something in the air broke open. As the day went on, the house filled with small sounds, the hum of the heater, the creak of the staircase, the faint crackle of the fire. None of it felt haunting anymore. It felt alive. I wandered through the rooms, touching the frames on the walls, the polished wood of the banister. The small imperfections that had once made the place feel cold, now they felt human. By afternoon, the snow outside had deepened, blanketing the driveway and softening the outlines of the trees. I found myself standing by the window again, the same spot where she had once stood when I returned home. But this time, there was no distance between us. She came to stand beside me, our reflections merging faintly in the glass. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of understanding. "Yes," I replied, "but I'll come back." She nodded, eyes fixed on the snow. "I'll keep the fire lit," she said softly. I smiled, not needing to answer. The snow outside shimmered in the pale afternoon light, each flake landing silently, building something new over what had been broken. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked to the mantel. The locket still rested there untouched. I opened it one last time, tracing the outline of their faces. Then I placed my father's letters beside it, the two halves of a story finally made whole. The fire had nearly gone out, but a few embers still glowed faintly in the ashes. I crouched and blew gently, watching as a small flame flickered back to life. The warmth brushed against my skin, fragile but real. I sat there for a while, listening to the wind outside, the faint rhythm of snow against the windows. And then I whispered, not to her, not to him, but to the space that had held all of us together, even through the worst of it. "You were right, Dad. The snow did bring us home." As the flame steadied and the house settled into quiet again, I felt the peace I'd been chasing finally settle too. Not loud or triumphant, but gentle, like forgiveness itself.